The abandoned girl. The sky above the wild planet was always dark, covered with heavy clouds that never moved. The ground was rough, cracked, and dry. Giant, twisted trees stood like broken skeletons, and monstrous creatures roamed freely, searching for anything weak enough to devour. Deep among the sharp rocks and thorny plants, a young alien girl lay still, barely breathing. Her name was Lyra. Her body was bruised and bloodied. Her silver-blue skin was stained with dust and old wounds. Her once bright eyes were dull, filled with pain and fear. Her legs were too weak to run, her arms too tired to fight. She had been left here to die, not by monsters, but by her own people. They had called her a failure, a disgrace, and instead of giving her a second chance, they threw her onto this cursed planet like garbage. No ship, no supplies, only a cruel choice. Survive somehow, or be eaten alive. Lyra pressed herself deeper, into the crack between two rocks, hoping the monsters hunting nearby wouldn't smell her. Her stomach growled painfully, but she didn't dare move. She had seen what happened to others who made noise. The monsters were fast, faster than anything she had ever seen. She hugged her knees to her chest, her whole body trembling. Every breath was a battle. Every heartbeat was a prayer. For 3 days she had survived by hiding and drinking rainwater caught in leaves. But she knew she couldn't last much longer. Her strength was almost gone. The growls of the monstrous creatures echoed across the plains. Huge beasts with armored skin, glowing eyes and sharp claws. They hunted anything that moved. Lyra closed her eyes tightly. Maybe it was better to give up. Maybe it was better to stop fighting. But then something changed. A loud roar shook the sky, louder than any monster. Lyra opened her eyes in terror and looked up. A fireball was falling from the clouds, leaving a trail of smoke and flames behind. It crashed into the ground a few miles away with a deafening explosion. For a long moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then the ground rumbled under her, and the monsters howled and ran toward the crash. Lyra stayed frozen, unsure what to do. Curiosity burned inside her, stronger than fear. Something, or someone, had fallen from the sky. Maybe it was another enemy. Maybe it was another trap. But maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Hope. Slowly, painfully, Lyra crawled out from her hiding place. She stumbled across the rocky field, every step sending pain shooting through her body. She kept low, hiding behind broken trees and boulders, moving closer to the crash site. In the distance, she saw the wreckage, a small ship, smoking and broken, half buried in the dirt. Around it, the monsters circled carefully, sniffing the air, growling. Lyra crouched behind a rock, heart pounding. Then she saw him, a figure climbing out of the wreckage, coughing and limping. A human. He was tall, covered in dust and blood, but his movements were strong and determined. He carried a strange weapon in one hand and dragged a small supply pack with the other. Lyra watched, amazed. Humans were rare out here. Dangerous too, she had been taught. Cruel and selfish. But this one didn't look cruel. He looked lost. Alone. The monsters snarled and charged toward him. The human didn't run. He lifted his weapon and fired. Sharp flashes of blue light cutting through the air. 2 monsters fell instantly, but more kept coming. Lyra's heart raced. He couldn't fight them. All he would die here, just like she almost had, and yet he fought anyway. Wounded, alone, facing death. He fought. Something inside Lyra stirred. Something she thought was long dead. She couldn't just watch. She couldn't turn away. Gathering the last of her strength, she picked up a heavy rock and hurled it at one of the monsters from behind. It wasn't much, but it distracted them just long enough. The human turned and saw her. Their eyes met for one brief, electric moment. He shouted something she couldn't understand, but his meaning was clear. Run. Without thinking, Lyra turned and ran, leading some of the monsters away from him. She didn't know if she would survive. She didn't know if he would survive. But in that moment, 2 strangers, one human, one alien, had chosen to fight together against the darkness, not as enemies, not as prey, but as survivors. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The human stranger, the forest swallowed them quickly. Lyra stumbled. Through the thick roots and heavy ferns, her lungs burning, her legs barely holding her up. Behind her, the growls of the monstrous creatures echoed across the broken land. She dared a glance over her shoulder. The human was still fighting. Even injured, even surrounded, he refused to fall. Lyra ducked behind a fallen tree and watched, fear and awe twisting inside her. The human spun, fired, moved, every action sharp, full of purpose. He wasn't running from death. He was challenging it. But there were too many monsters. Even the strongest warrior would not survive alone. Lyra knew this world. She knew the paths the monsters hunted, the places they feared. She could help him, but helping him could mean her own death. Her heart pounded as she hesitated. Trust no one. Her old teachers had hammered those words into her mind again and again. Trusting had gotten her abandoned once. Trusting had almost killed her before. And yet, something about this human was different. He was fighting not just for himself. He had tried to protect her, a stranger, without asking anything in return. Clenching her teeth, Lyra made her choice. She grabbed a heavy branch lying nearby and smashed it against a stone, creating a loud, sharp noise. The monsters closest to the human paused, their heads snapping toward the sound. The human didn't waste the moment. He fired a quick burst from his weapon, taking down 2 more creatures, then sprinted toward her location. Lyra turned and ran deeper into the forest, leading the way through narrow paths only she knew. The human followed, limping but determined. Behind them, the monsters roared and gave chase. The ground was rough and slippery. Thorny vines clawed at their skin. Strange insects buzzed in the heavy air. But Lyra didn't stop. Neither did the human. After what felt like endless minutes, she led them into a narrow ravine hidden by thick vines. The entrance was small, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Lyra squeezed through the gap first, then turned and waved urgently at the human. He dove after her just as the monsters skidded into view, snarling and snapping at the air, but they didn't follow. The creatures paced outside the ravine, growling and clawing at the rocks, but after a few minutes, they gave up and wandered away. It was too tight for them to fit. Lyra slumped against the cool stone wall, panting, her whole body shaking. The human sat a few feet away, cradling his injured arm. Sweat dripped from his forehead and blood stained his torn uniform. For a long time they just stared at each other, catching their breath. No words, only the heavy silence of survival. Slowly, the human reached into his pack and pulled out a small, silver packet. He tore it open and offered it to her. Food. Lyra's stomach twisted painfully at the smell, but she hesitated. This could be a trick. Poisoned food. A test. She looked into his eyes, searching for a trap. All she saw was exhaustion and kindness. Cautiously, she took the packet and nibbled a corner. It was bland and dry, but it was food. The human smiled slightly, a tired, broken smile that somehow made her chest ache. He pulled out a second packet and ate with her, slow and careful. Trust, fragile and uncertain, began to build between them. He tapped his chest and said a word. Ethan. His voice was low, rough from smoke and fighting. He pointed at her gently, waiting. Lyra hesitated. No one had asked her name in so long. She almost forgot it mattered. Softly she whispered, Lyra. Lyra. Ethan repeated carefully, as if tasting the sound. She nodded. A small bond formed in the darkness between them, built not with promises but with survival, with shared fear, with silent understanding. Outside, the monsters howled again. Danger still waited, death still hunted. But inside, the ravine, 2 strangers, 1 human, 1 alien, had found something stronger than fear. Hope. They didn't know if they could escape this planet. They didn't know if they could trust each other fully. But for now, they would try. Ethan leaned back against the wall, wincing as he pressed, a hand to his bleeding side. Lyra crawled closer, her hands shaking as she tore a strip of cloth from her ruined clothes. Without speaking, she began to bandage his wound. Ethan watched her quietly, allowing it. In another world, in another time, they might have been enemies, but here, on this dying planet filled with monsters, they were something else. Partners, allies, survivors. As the darkness deepened and the stars blinked coldly above, Lyra and Ethan sat side by side, two broken souls holding on to the fragile thread of life, together. Hiding from monsters, the night wrapped the forest in a thick, heavy silence. Every shadow seemed deeper, every distant sound sharper. Somewhere beyond the ravine, the monstrous creatures roamed, searching, hunting. Inside the narrow space between the rocks, Ethan and Lyra sat close, barely breathing. Ethan checked his weapon quietly, making sure it was ready if they were found. His injured side throbbed with every small movement, but he ignored the pain. He had bigger things to worry about. Lyra watched him, her large silver eyes wide and alert. She clutched a sharp stone she had picked up earlier, her small fingers trembling but ready. They didn't speak. Words would only bring death. Instead, they listened. The ground vibrated slightly under them. The monsters were getting closer again, their heavy footsteps sending tiny stones rolling down the ravine walls. Ethan slowly reached out and placed a hand over Lyra's, gently lowering the stone she held. "Not yet," he whispered. Lyra nodded silently. Through a crack in the rocks they could see movement, dark shapes moving swiftly through the trees, sniffing the ground, growling deep in their throats. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't stay here forever. The monsters would eventually find the entrance. They needed a plan. He glanced at Lyra, wondering what she knew about this planet. She noticed his look and pointed upward. The ravine walls were steep but not impossible to climb. Vines and broken rocks could offer handholds. Escape was dangerous. But staying meant certain death. Ethan gave her a small nod. They would climb. He motioned for Lyra to go first. She hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes. But Ethan smiled gently, giving her the courage she needed. Slowly, silently, Lyra began to climb the wall, her small hands finding grips in the rough stone. Ethan followed close behind, wincing with every pull on his injured side. The climb was hard. The stone was cold and slippery with moss. Once Lyra slipped and Ethan's heart stopped, but she caught herself, steady and brave. Above them, a monster roared, its breath rattling the trees. They had to move, faster, hand over hand, foot over foot. They climbed. Finally, after what felt like forever, Lyra reached the top. She pulled herself up and looked around carefully. No monsters in sight. She turned and stretched out her hand for Ethan. He gritted his teeth against the pain and took it. Together, they scrambled over the edge and into the thicker part of the forest. Beyond, they didn't stop to rest. They ran. Low branches scratched their faces. Thorns tore at their clothes. Hidden roots grabbed at their feet. But they ran. The monsters howled behind them, angry at losing their prey. Ethan and Lyra ran deeper into the forest, where the trees grew close together and the ground dipped into tangled valleys. They found a fallen tree, its massive trunk hollowed out with age, and crawled inside. The space was tight, damp, filled with the smell of rot and moss. But it was hidden. Safe, for now. They collapsed inside, gasping for breath, too tired to move. Outside, the monsters prowled the forest, sniffing, growling. Ethan pulled Lyra close, shielding her with his body. He could feel her trembling, could hear her heart pounding almost as loud as his own, but she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She was a survivor, just like him. The hours passed slowly. The cold crept into their bones. At one point, Ethan drifted into a half-sleep, only to be jolted awake by a loud snarl nearby. He tightened his arm around Lyra, ready to fight if needed. But the monster moved away, chasing some other noise. When the sun finally began to rise, the monsters retreated into their dark caves, hiding from the light. Only then did Ethan and Lyra dare to move. They crawled out of the fallen tree, their bodies stiff and sore. The forest looked different in the daylight, less terrifying, but still dangerous. Ethan looked down at Lyra. She was pale, her clothes torn, her feet bleeding from cuts. But when he met her eyes, he saw something fierce burning there. She wasn't giving up. Neither was he. He crouched down and tore a strip from his shirt, carefully wrapping it around her injured feet. Lyra watched him silently, her hands resting in her lap. No one had ever cared for her wounds before. No one had ever treated her like she mattered. When he finished, she touched his hand lightly, a silent, "Thank you." Ethan smiled tiredly. They weren't safe yet. The planet was still full of monsters, both beast and man. But for the first time since they had crashed onto this cursed world, Ethan felt a small spark of hope. They had survived one night together, and maybe, just maybe, they could survive one more. The secret of her past, the forest, was quiet now. Only the soft whisper of the wind moved through the trees. The monsters had gone back to their dark holes, and for a little while, it almost felt like the world had forgotten its cruelty. Ethan and Lyra sat near a small stream, drinking the cold, clear water. The sun was weak overhead, struggling through the heavy clouds. Ethan watched Lyra carefully. She was different when the monsters were gone. Still cautious, still silent. But there was something in her eyes. Something more than fear. Something like sadness. Ethan wanted to ask her about it, but he didn't know how, so he started with the only thing he could offer, his own story. He tapped his chest lightly. "Ethan," he said again. Then he pointed to the sky, mimicking a ship crashing down. "Pilot," he said. Lyra tilted her head, understanding slowly. She pointed at herself, then at the ground, her small fingers tracing a circle. She had not fallen from the sky. She had been left here, abandoned. Ethan frowned. He picked up a stick and scratched a picture into the dirt, a group of people walking away from a small figure. Then he looked at her. Lyra nodded, her face tight with pain. They had left her to die. Ethan felt anger boil inside him, hot and sharp. He didn't understand all of her story yet, but he understood enough. No one deserved that, especially not someone like her. Carefully, he drew another picture. A ship, a bright sun, two small figures standing together. He pointed at her and smiled gently. Together, safe. For a long moment, Lyra just stared at the drawing. Then her small hand reached out, shaky and hesitant, and she drew a mark next to his. A symbol, simple and rough. Her name, Lyra. Her first act of hope in what must have been a very long time. Ethan smiled wider, his heart aching. He wanted to ask more, to know everything, but he stayed patient. He knew wounds like hers needed time. And then, slowly, she began to speak. Her voice was soft, broken. Pieces of words in her language, broken by fear and sadness. But Ethan listened carefully, piecing the story together. Lyra had been part of an elite squad, trained for war, raised for victory. She had been small, but strong, quiet, but smart. On her final mission, she had been ordered to destroy a village, a place filled with helpless aliens, families with children. She had refused. She had stood against her own commanders. She had begged for mercy, and for that, she had been labeled a traitor. Punishment was swift and cruel. They had thrown her onto this planet, stripped of her weapons, her armor, her place in their world, left to be torn apart by monsters. Ethan sat in stunned silence as she finished, her eyes lowered to the ground. He felt like he couldn't breathe. How could anyone do that? How could anyone look at this brave, broken girl and see only failure? Without thinking, Ethan reached out and gently took her hand. She flinched at first. Then, slowly, she allowed it. He squeezed her fingers softly. "Not a failure," he said, even though he knew she couldn't understand the words. "You're a hero." Lyra's shoulders shook, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her head and looked him straight. In the eyes, there was strength there, quiet, steady strength. She had been abandoned, betrayed, left for dead. But she was still here, still fighting. And now, she wasn't alone. Ethan knew they couldn't stay by the stream for long. The monsters would return. The hunters might find them. The planet itself seemed determined to kill anything weak or lost. But they would survive. Together. He squeezed her hand again and stood up, offering her his other hand to pull her to her feet. She took it. No hesitation. No fear. For the first time, since he had crashed onto this nightmare world, Ethan felt something more powerful than fear, hope. They moved forward, step by step, into the unknown forest. Their journey was far from over. But now, they carried something stronger than weapons or armor. They carried trust. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. The monsters' attack. The forest grew darker as the day slipped away. Long shadows stretched between the trees, and the air grew heavy with the smell of rain and fear. Ethan and Lyra moved carefully, staying low, avoiding open spaces. Their steps were slow but steady. They had no real plan, no real hope of rescue. Only survival, one moment at a time. They reached a small clearing surrounded by giant rocks and thick trees. A shallow cave opened against one side, not deep but enough to hide for the night. Ethan checked the surroundings carefully. It was risky, but they needed rest. Lyra crawled into the cave first, curling up against the cool stone wall. She was shivering, her small body exhausted from days of running, hiding, and fear. Ethan sat at the entrance, his weapon ready, his eyes scanning the dark woods. He knew this small peace would not last. Danger was always near, and it came faster than he expected. A low growl rumbled through the trees. Ethan tensed, his hand tightening around the weapon. Then another growl, and another. From the left, from the right. They were surrounded. Shadows moved between the trees. Large, fast, hungry. The monstrous creatures had found their trail again. Ethan glanced back at Lyra. She was awake now, sitting up, her wide silver eyes shining with fear. He gave her a small, steady nod. They would fight. Together. The first monster burst from the trees, charging straight toward them. Ethan fired, the pulse shot slamming into the creature's chest. It stumbled, roared in pain, but didn't fall. Another one followed, and another. There were too many. Ethan pulled Lyra behind him, standing between her and the monsters. The creatures circled, growling low, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. Ethan fired again, hitting another monster in the leg. It screamed and fell, thrashing wildly, but the others didn't stop. They smelled weakness. They smelled blood. They attacked. Ethan fought hard, moving fast, firing with deadly aim. Each shot counted. Each movement mattered, but they were strong, too strong. One of the creatures slammed into him, knocking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, the weapon flying from his hand. Pain exploded through his body. The monster lunged at him. Ethan braced for impact, but it never came. A sharp cry tore through the clearing. Lyra. She had picked up a broken branch and thrown it with all her strength, striking the monster's eye. It roared in rage, turning away from Ethan. Ethan grabbed a sharp stone and drove it into the monster's throat. It collapsed, thrashing and snarling. Ethan pulled himself up, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. Lyra was beside him, her small body shaking, but her face fierce. More monsters rushed in. Ethan grabbed his weapon from the dirt and fired wildly, backing toward the rocks. "Inside," he shouted, pushing Lyra toward the cave. They stumbled inside, the monsters clawing at the entrance. Ethan set the weapon to overload and threw it at the cave mouth. "Get down!" he yelled, pulling Lyra to the ground. The explosion shook the earth, filling the air with smoke and fire. The entrance collapsed, sealing them inside. Darkness swallowed them. Silence fell. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Lyra reached out, touching Ethan's arm. He was breathing. Hurt, but alive. "We're okay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. They had survived. Again. Barely, Ethan leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. His body screamed with pain. His head spun. But his heart was steady. Lyra crawled closer, resting her, head lightly against his shoulder. Together in the dark, they found a small piece of safety, a small piece of hope. They had fought the monsters, and won. But Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, more dangers waited. Rescue was still a distant dream. But for now, he let himself believe. They had each other, and as long as they stayed together, they had a chance. Even in the darkest places, even on a world that wanted them dead, they would survive. A desperate escape. The cave was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of burned stone. Ethan shifted slightly, feeling every bruise and cut across his body. Beside him, Lyra slept fitfully, her small form curled tightly like she was trying to disappear into the rock itself. Ethan knew they couldn't stay. The collapsed entrance had bought them time, but not safety. The monsters would find another way, and even if they didn't, the lack of food, the creeping cold, and the endless fear would kill them just as surely. They needed a plan. Ethan gently shook Lyra awake. Her eyes fluttered open, tired but still full of that small spark of trust. He pointed upwards, then made climbing motions with his hands. They needed to find a way out, maybe through cracks in the cave roof or hidden tunnels leading up to the surface. Lyra nodded weakly. Slowly, painfully, they began to move deeper into the cave. The floor sloped upward slightly. Small beams of light leaked through cracks in the stone ceiling. Roots dangled from above, thick and strong. Ethan smiled grimly. They would climb. He lifted Lyra, first helping her grab the roots. She was light and quick, scrambling upward like a small shadow. Then Ethan followed, every movement sending sharp pain through his ribs. The climb was long and dangerous. Twice Ethan nearly slipped. Once a root snapped under his weight, sending loose stones tumbling into the darkness below. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Near the top, a narrow gap opened to the outside world. Ethan shoved against the loose rocks, forcing the opening. Wider, bright sunlight poured through, blinding after so many hours in the dark. Fresh air filled his lungs. They had made it. He pushed Lyra up first, then hauled himself through the gap. They collapsed onto the grassy hilltop, gasping, laughing breathlessly with pure relief. The forest stretched out below them, a sea of green and gold under the morning sun. For a moment, everything felt almost peaceful. Almost. But the peace didn't last. In the distance, Ethan saw movement. Black shapes cutting through the trees. Hunters, not monsters, not wild animals. Intelligent hunters sent to find them. Maybe bounty hunters. Maybe soldiers. Maybe worse. Whoever they were moving fast, and they were coming straight for them. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her to her feet. No time to rest. No time to think. Only run. They stumbled down the hillside, weaving, between tall trees, jumping over fallen logs and ducking under low branches. Behind them, the hunters grew closer. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest. His wounds screamed with every step. But he didn't let go of Lyra's hand. She was running too, her small body moving with surprising speed and strength. She was scared, but she was not broken. They raced across a shallow stream, splashing through the cold water. They climbed a steep bank covered in sharp rocks, hands bleeding from the effort. They ran until their legs gave out, until the world blurred around them. But it wasn't enough. The hunters were too fast. A loud crack split the air. A warning shot fired just above their heads. Ethan dragged Lyra behind a thick tree, pressing her against the trunk. He could see them now. 4 figures in dark armor, their faces hidden, their weapons glowing. They spread out, closing in carefully. These weren't wild beasts. They were professionals. They wouldn't make mistakes. Ethan knew they couldn't outrun them, not anymore. He checked his belt. He had one. Flare left. A rescue beacon. But firing it would reveal their exact position, and if no one was close enough to answer the call, it would only speed up their death. Ethan looked at Lyra. She met his gaze, calm and steady, trusting him, believing in him. He couldn't let her down. Ethan pulled the flare from his belt. He showed it to Lyra, then pointed to the sky. She nodded once. He smiled grimly. "Hold on," he whispered. Then he fired the flare. A bright red light shot into the sky, exploding with a loud crack. The hunters reacted instantly, rushing toward the sound. Ethan grabbed Lyra and ran again, not away this time, but toward a rocky outcrop where they could make a final stand. They scrambled up the rocks just as the hunters burst into the clearing. No cover, no escape. Ethan positioned himself in front of Lyra, raising his makeshift weapon, an old broken branch sharpened to a deadly point. The hunters raised their guns. Ethan braced himself. Then, out of nowhere, a roar filled the sky. A ship. A real ship. A rescue team. The ship descended fast, its engines blasting wind across the clearing. The hunters turned, confused. And in that moment of hesitation, soldiers from the ship rappelled down on ropes, weapons ready. A short, brutal fight followed. Ethan shielded Lyra, keeping her low and safe. When it ended, the hunters lay scattered, captured, or dead. Strong arms lifted Ethan to his feet. "You're safe now," a voice said through the helmet. Ethan barely managed a nod before collapsing. Strong hands caught him. As darkness closed in, he felt Lyra's small hand slip into his one more time. Still holding on. Still surviving. Together. Saved and chosen. The soft hum of the rescue ship wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the bright, clean light. He was lying on a medical bed covered with a thin white sheet. His wounds were bandaged. Fresh air, not the choking smoke of the forest, filled his lungs. He turned his head carefully. In the next bed, wrapped in a warm blanket, Lyra slept deeply. Her small chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Her face, once tight with fear, was calm now. Safe. Ethan smiled weakly. They had made it. The door to the medical bay slid open with a soft hiss. A human officer walked in, tall, strong, wearing a rescue badge. He smiled kindly at Ethan. "You're lucky," he said. "We picked up your emergency flare just in time." Ethan nodded, his throat too dry to speak yet. The officer's smile faded slightly. "We need to ask you some questions," he said gently. "About the girl." Ethan's heart clenched. He looked at Lyra, so small and vulnerable. He remembered the hunters. He remembered the cruelty. He knew the dangers were not over. If the wrong people learned what she was and where she came from, she would be treated as a weapon, not as a person. He couldn't let that happen. He forced his voice to work. "She's under my protection," Ethan said slowly. "She's not dangerous. She's one of us." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Understood," he said. No threats, no arguments. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where she could heal, where they both could heal. Over the next few days, Ethan recovered. Slowly, painfully. He spent most of his time sitting beside Lyra's bed, talking to her softly, telling her stories about Earth, about oceans and mountains, and blue skies without monsters. Lyra listened carefully, her eyes wide with wonder. One evening, as the ship floated quietly among the stars, Lyra woke fully for the first time. She sat up, looking around with confusion. Ethan smiled and reached out his hand. "You're safe," he said gently. Lyra hesitated, then placed her small hand in his. No fear, no doubt, only trust. The rescue crew gave them clothes, food, a small cabin to share. They were free to choose their next path. "What do you want to do?" the officer asked Ethan one day. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I want to stay with her," he said. "I want to give her a life. A real one." The officer nodded again. "You've earned it." Later, in their small cabin, Ethan sat with Lyra, showing her maps of different planets, places where they could live peacefully, far from war, far from betrayal. Lyra pointed at a small green world, with wide oceans and endless forests. She smiled. A real smile. Ethan laughed softly. "Good choice," he said. They made plans. Small, simple plans. Find a home. Build a new life. Be free. No masters. No hunters. No monsters. Just a human and an alien girl who had been thrown away by their worlds, and who had found each other among the ruins. On the last night before landing, Ethan stood by the window watching the stars drift past. Lyra joined him, her small hand slipping into his without a word. Together, they looked out into the endless sky. A new world waited for them. A new life, not given by those who thought they owned them, but chosen by them. For the first time in her life, Lyra was not just surviving, she was living. And Ethan, once lost and alone, had found something worth fighting for. Under the vast open stars, two broken souls had become something whole. A family, a hope, a future. Together, always.